when they're talking about crucifixion is a guy called Flavius Josephus. Flavius Josephus was a Jewish historian that wrote about many things in the time of Jesus.
In the endless sea of history, some writings stand out like rare treasures, gleaming fragments that bridge the world of faith with the world of fact.
What if the most startling proof of Jesus didn't come from a disciple, a church, or even the Bible, but from a man who never followed him at all? Nearly 2,000 years ago, a Jewish historian named Flavius Josephus wrote something so bold that later generations tried to erase it, rewrite it, or hide it from history. His words were not sermons. They were not teachings of faith. They were records, cold, historical, and meant to outlive empires. Yet what he wrote about Jesus still shakes scholars today. Long before anyone called him controversial, Josephus was simply a man of his time, born just a few years after the crucifixion of Jesus. He wasn't raised in the Christian faith. He didn't follow the apostles. He didn't preach the gospel. He came from a priestly Jewish family, trained in law, scripture, and politics. And by adulthood, he was already connected to the very leaders who once opposed Jesus. He survived war, met emperors, and became a historian trusted by Rome. He wrote to preserve facts, not faith. That's what makes his account so hard to dismiss. His testimony wasn't meant to convert anyone, yet it confirmed things believers had been saying for decades. But how did a man like that end up writing about Jesus at all? Josephus didn't grow up in a peaceful world. Jerusalem was boiling with tension. Rome controlled the land with force. The temple priests fought to keep their power, and different Jewish groups battled over how to survive foreign rule. The Pharisees guarded tradition. The Sadducees cooperated with Rome. The Zealots wanted war. And somewhere in the middle of that chaos, stories about Jesus of Nazareth were still spreading. Josephus joined the Pharisees, the same group that once clashed with Jesus. He knew their arguments, their fears, and their influence. When the rebellion rose against Rome, Josephus became a commander in the Jewish revolt. But the war failed. The temple burned, and Josephus was captured. What happened next changed his life and may explain why his words about Jesus were preserved at all. When Josephus was captured by the Romans, his fate should have ended on the battlefield or at the execution block, but he did something unexpected. He made a prophecy, claiming that the Roman general leading the siege, Vespasian, would one day become emperor. At first, the Romans scoffed, but when the prediction came true, everything changed. Josephus was spared, given protection, and eventually brought to Rome. He was granted citizenship and allowed to write under imperial patronage. The same empire that crushed Jerusalem now paid him to record history. He wasn't a rebel anymore. He was an insider, a witness with access to power, politics, and memory. And it's from that position, far from the ruins of Jerusalem, that he wrote something unusual about a man named Jesus. But was it a neutral record, or something more daring? Decades after the death of Jesus, Josephus began writing his most famous work, Antiquities of the Jews. It was meant to document Jewish history for Roman readers. Most of it dealt with kings, wars, and laws. But in Book 18, in the middle of political events, he suddenly mentions a man, Jesus. He calls him a wise man. He says he performed wonderful works. He notes that both Jews and non-Jews followed him. He writes that Pilate had him executed. And then comes the line that has shaken historians ever since. Josephus says Jesus appeared alive again on the third day. This wasn't a sermon. It wasn't scripture. It was written by someone outside the faith. But that wasn't the only time he mentioned him. The second reference might be even harder to explain. Many people only know about the first passage, but Josephus mentioned Jesus again in a completely different context. In Book 20 of Antiquities, he describes the death of a man named James. But he doesn't just call him James. He identifies him as the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ. There's no debate over this one. Even skeptical scholars admit that Josephus wrote those words. There's no Christian-style language, no praise, no preaching, but just a historical reference to Jesus as someone already known by name. This means Josephus didn't just acknowledge Jesus once. He marked him as a real person with real followers connected to real events. So if Josephus wrote this so clearly, why do so many people claim his testimony was altered or worse, suppressed?
The controversy didn't start in our time. Not long after Josephus's works were copied and passed down, debates began. Some early Christian scribes may have added phrases like, "He was the Christ," to make the passage sound more faithful. That led critics to claim the entire text was forged. But the problem is, parts of the wording don't sound Christian at all. Then something unexpected happened. In the 1970s, researchers found an Arabic version of Josephus's writings. This copy contained a toned-down reference to Jesus, without the phrases scholars argued were later additions. Yet it still confirmed that Jesus was known for miracles, was condemned under Pilate, and had followers who claimed he rose again. So if parts were edited, what parts were original? And more importantly, who tried to change his words and why? To understand why Josephus wrote the way he did, you have to see the danger of his position. He wasn't a preacher spreading hope. He was a historian with Roman oversight. Writing openly in favor of Jesus could have cost him everything. Rome still remembered Christian uprisings. Jewish leaders still rejected Jesus as the Messiah. And Josephus was caught between both worlds. So, instead of praising or condemning, he recorded the facts, carefully, cautiously, and without personal devotion. His language is distant but direct. He never calls himself a believer. He never promotes the movement. Yet he still confirmed Jesus' existence, his execution, and his growing influence. It raises a disturbing question. If a man loyal to Rome and rooted in Judaism still mentioned Jesus, how impossible was it to ignore him? And what else did Josephus witness that he didn't write openly? When Josephus was writing, Christianity wasn't a global faith, it was a growing problem. Rome viewed the followers of Jesus as troublemakers who refused to bow to emperors. The Jewish leaders saw them as a breakaway movement that threatened tradition. To both sides, Christians were inconvenient, divisive, and increasingly hard to silence. Yet Josephus still acknowledged them. He didn't dismiss them as a rumor. He didn't erase their leader. He documented their existence as a surviving tribe that refused to disappear. That single phrase is explosive. For a historian under Roman protection to admit that the movement lived on meant only one thing: Jesus wasn't fading from memory. So if parts were edited, what truths did he hint at without fully revealing? And was history already trying to bury what he preserved? What Josephus wrote wasn't just historical. It lined up with the message believers were already spreading. He mentioned the crucifixion under Pilate, the same event recorded in all four Gospels. He hinted at miracles. He noted that Jesus drew followers from Jews and Gentiles, and his reference to the third day mirrors what the earliest Christians were already preaching. Even the Old Testament seems to echo through his words. Isaiah spoke of someone wounded for our transgressions long before Josephus was born. The Psalms described a righteous one who would not be abandoned to death. Josephus didn't quote these prophecies, but his account didn't deny them either. His testimony wasn't religious writing, but it supported what the early church declared by faith. But the real impact of his words wouldn't be felt until centuries later. Josephus never knew how much debate his words would spark. For centuries, scribes copied his works, historians argued over them, and critics tried to explain them away. Some wanted his testimony erased. Others tried to reshape it. Yet somehow, through wars, fire, forgetting, and revision, his words about Jesus survived. He wasn't a believer. He wasn't a disciple. Yet he recorded what skeptics never expected, that Jesus lived, that he was executed, and that his followers claimed he rose again and refused to vanish. A man with no reason to defend the faith still confirmed its foundation. But here's the question most people never ask. If this much truth survived through censorship and centuries, what else did Josephus write about Jesus that we haven't seen yet?